Hello, my friends, and welcome to my brand new podcast, the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast. My name is Michael Lovins. I am the host of this podcast. The first thing that you may be asking is, why on earth did you call it the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast? It's a great question. I appreciate you asking. You're already getting interactive with the show, and this is fantastic. And just to make sure that I discourage all future interactivity, I'm going to tell you I'm just not going to quite answer that question now. Because the purpose of this episode is just to introduce you to the podcast, give you an idea what it's going to be about, but I do promise that in a future, not too future, but a little bit future episode, I will go into some depth about what I mean by personal responsibility lawyer. Suffice it to say for now that I have completely invented a new field of law. Invented sounds much better than just made up, which is probably more accurate, but I'm going to go with the invented term because I like to make myself sound smart whenever I can. It's not necessarily an easy task for me, so I'll take the low-hanging fruit. Since I invented/made up this whole new industry of law, that means I have a monopoly on it, which is a great thing to have. You make crazy money when you have a monopoly. I know because I do have a bachelor's in economics, so I know basically everything there is to know about monopolies. Please do not report me to the antitrust division of the Federal Department of Justice, however, because I'm sure they'll come shut me down right away. Yeah, probably not, but whatever. So again, the purpose of this episode is to tell you what the podcast is going to be about and not necessarily to explain the title. But the problem I have on doing this is I don't exactly know what it's going to be about. It's basically going to be about stuff that I find interesting. Well, don't tell my mom this, but I'm not really all that special. I'm pretty much like a whole lot of other people. So if I find something interesting, there's probably a whole lot of other people who will also find that interesting. Now, not everybody will find it interesting because while I'm not really very special, I am a little weird. But I think that there's a fair number, a pretty good number of people out there who are a pretty similar kind of weird. And so I'm going to put some stuff out there that I find interesting. I hope you find it interesting. And if you do, listen along and have some fun with us. I know I've wanted to do a podcast for roughly 80, 85 years, something like that, give or take. You might have to adjust for the length of my life to date and also the length of the existence of a podcast. It may or may not be long enough to justify that 80 to 85 years, but whatever, who's counting? I didn't do it for a long time because I couldn't decide what on earth I would do it about. I would come up with a really broad topic, and I think, well, that's just too broad. And then I'd come up with a really narrow topic that I thought was really interesting, but I thought, well, that's maybe 2 episodes worth. So I just didn't do it. But eventually I realized that was not really a very good excuse. In fact, it was a stupid excuse, and in fact, it didn't excuse anything at all. So it was a reason, but it wasn't really an excuse. So I'm going to do a podcast. And I'll figure out what it's about while I'm doing it. And I hope you come along for the ride. And you'll find out what it's about while I'm doing it too. Now, to be fair, I do have a few categories of topics that I do know I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to guarantee at this point that every episode will fall into one of these categories. But a large portion of the episodes will be interviews or conversations with people who know a whole lot more about topics than I do. Most of the topics will have some sort of connection to taking ownership of your own life, and specifically using the civil justice system to demand that people own their own bad choices and the consequences of those bad choices. Sometimes we're going to talk about ways that the government creates obstacles for people who are trying to enjoy the fruits of their labors. Really, that's just consequences of good decisions. And then sometimes we're going to talk about how the government, which of course is really us, tramples some people who've made some bad choices, and it makes it next to impossible for people to dig out of a hole. So they may have dug their own holes, and so it's easy to stand back and self-righteously say, well, they dug their own hole, so that's their own problem. But we've all dug our own holes in various ways, and it's a whole lot better to find a way to help somebody dig out of their hole than to heap dirt on top of them and turn that hole into a grave. And we're going to talk about some of those things. I've already got a couple of episodes either recorded already or I'm working on getting that scheduled, and I'm really excited about those. I think they're going to be really good, really informative, and most of all, interesting. So we're going to talk about people who are at the top of the heap, and we're going to talk about people who've taken up residence at the bottom. We're going to talk about justice. We'll talk about injustice. We're going to talk about how to improve the former and correct the latter. Fair warning, we're going to talk about politics and religion. So if you play this Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast at Thanksgiving dinner, well, that's on you. You've been warned. Not supposed to talk about politics and religion, especially at Thanksgiving dinner, especially in this political climate. So that's on you. We're going to talk about law because, well, I'm a lawyer. Even before I was a personal responsibility lawyer, a self-proclaimed one, but whatever. I've been a lawyer since 2001. So as of this recording, we're right about 17 years that I've been practicing law. So I know something about law. I know something about trials. And there's a lot of that is interesting, I think, to people who aren't lawyers. So whether you're a lawyer or not, we'll be talking about some of that, and I think that you'll find it interesting. I'm also looking for stories of people that are just plain inspiring. Stories from people who have faced great odds, and yet they overcame those odds. That's something that you can only do by really taking personal responsibility for your own choices. And you also do that by getting some serious help along the way. Personal responsibility is not synonymous with being a self-made man. Any successful person, no matter what area of life they find success in, they have some combination of owning their own choices and getting a lot of help along the way. There's an old saying that I love. It says, if you ever see a turtle sitting on a fence post, you can be sure he didn't get there by himself. Here's what I do not want this podcast to be: an echo chamber. If you need a safe space where you won't hear any ideas or opinions that you disagree with, just shut this thing off now, because this is the wrong place for you. Don't subscribe. You probably don't give me a rating, but this is not the podcast for you. I want to hear opinions that are different from mine. I do. I want to talk to people of goodwill who are smart and who are thoughtful and who disagree with me. That's not that hard to find. In our current political culture, in our current political climate, we have a tendency to think that those who disagree with us are either stupid or evil. That does occur. I'm not going to pretend that nobody in the political discourse is either stupid or evil. There are both, but most people aren't. Most people just have a very different view of what other people have as to how to promote human flourishing. I want to dive into some of those topics, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it challenges my assumptions, even if it challenges my logic. I want to understand opinions that are different from mine. It will sharpen and refine my opinions. Maybe sometimes I'll be persuaded. Any of us who think we know everything and we are unpersuadable on any but a very small core set of principles, we're fooling ourselves. And we're fooling ourselves to our own detriment. So if you want a safe space where you're not going to hear things that you don't necessarily like or agree with, find another podcast or cable news show or whatever. This isn't the place for that. I told you a little bit earlier about why I did not start a podcast for a long time, because I couldn't really come up with the topic that was narrow or broad enough for it, even though I wanted to start something. But let me tell you an important fact about why I finally did take the leap to start the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. This podcast is always going to be sponsored by my law firm, Lovins Trosclair. I own half of it. It's the better half. If you don't believe me, just ask me. My law partner is Pete Trosclair, and we've been together as law partners for about 8 years now, I think. It's amazing how fast that time has flown. Most people will think of us as personal injury lawyers, and that's true. We think of ourselves as personal responsibility lawyers, and as I said before, there will be more on that in a future episode. But we help people who have suffered catastrophic injuries or have lost loved ones as a result of somebody else's irresponsible choices. Now, in legalese, an irresponsible choice is what we call negligence, and sometimes it's gross negligence. But it finally occurred to me, and this is a little embarrassingly obvious now, but it wasn't obvious to me for a long time for whatever reason, that if people don't know who we are and they don't know what we do, we can't help them when they need our help. And this podcast with the Lovins Trosclair sponsorship will help get the word out about what we do and who we can help. I'm not going to pretend that there's no financial motive for us in this, because there is. And I'm pretty sure that's pretty obvious to you as well. Helping people who go through these kinds of tragedies, that's what we do to earn a living and support our families. The legal problems that folks face in this kind of tragedy are sometimes they're unthinkably complex, especially for someone who doesn't deal with the legal system a lot. And it is really a great honor for us to be trusted by people in such a dark hour. We genuinely, truly, deeply, passionately hope that you never, ever need our services. I tell new clients or potential clients all the time, I always say, look, it is really nice to meet you, but I understand you never wanted to have to meet me, at least not under these circumstances. And that's very real. Nobody wants to come into my office and sit down and tell me about how, whatever the tragedy is that they have gone through and what their life looks like now because of what they've gone through. We also understand the reality of life, that some of you will need our services, nor someone who is important to you will need our services. If that awful time comes along, I do hope that you'll give us a call. The best way to do that is to call our office in Austin. We have offices in both Dallas and Austin. Our Austin number is 512-535-1649. You can find us on the internet at www.ltlegalteam.com. The LT at the beginning is for Lovins Trosclair, and then legalteam.com. We'll help you with the problems you face, the legal problems that you face. And as we do so, that is by holding people accountable for the bad choices that they've made, bad choices that have caused death, pain, and unimaginable and unbearable heartache. We try to make our communities safer. Now, I do have to give, the whole lawyer thing. We've always got to give disclaimers, so here we go. This podcast is not legal advice. You listening to this podcast does not make you my client. Neither does it make you the client of any guests who may appear on any particular episode of this podcast. If you want to be my client, call my office at 512-535-1649. If I hear about your case and agree to represent you, we will execute a written contract. Until that contract is signed, I'm not your lawyer. This is just the right way to do things, and it protects both you and me, and surely you knew this to be true without me telling you. If you didn't already know this, then me telling you probably won't help. Finally, I am not certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization. I'm not a board-certified personal responsibility lawyer, largely because the Texas Board of Legal Specialization doesn't certify personal responsibility lawyers or even have any idea that this new industry I invented/made up even exists. I'm not saying that they shouldn't know about it and they shouldn't certify people, but they don't. Neither am I certified in any other specialty by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization, and now I think all of the authorities are happy with my disclaimers. I'm really excited about doing the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. I think it's going to be a ton of fun. I hope you have half as much fun listening as I have creating this. And until next time, I'm Michael Lovins for the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast and Lovins Trosclair. See you next time.